Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a presentation from the League of Women Voters, Sarasota County. My name is Linda Thompson, and I serve as the president of our local league. It is marvelous to have you with us this evening. We're going to be talking a bit of history. It's interesting to me that last year, 2020, was the League of Women Voters. Last year was the League of Women Voters Centennial. Hopefully we can get that echo worked out. Meanwhile, we're going to Sarasota County is having its centennial this year. In any dynamic, people make a difference. And whether those people are today or part of our historical past, people always make a difference. And we're going to learn more about a certain person and how she positively impacted Sarasota County. It is my pleasure, as we continue on with the program, to introduce our events planning team leader, is Elena Visvari.
Thank you, Linda. It's great to be here. And as Linda said, I'm the events committee chair, and we are the ones that put together the presentations for the Sarasota League. Tonight's presentation describes the influence of the Chicago socialite and women's rights advocate who came to Sarasota in 1910 and transformed the sleepy little village. Our speaker, Dr. Frank Castle, is Professor Emeritus and President Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg. Dr. Castle has published several books. One of his most recent is Suncoast Empire. You can see the picture on the screen. Bertha Palmer, Her Family, and the Rise of Sarasota. Sarasota County Library System selected this book as its 2021 One Book, One Community book. Previously, Dr. Castle led the Sarasota County Historical Commission, and now he serves on the board of the History and Preservation Coalition. Dr. Castle currently chairs the Sarasota County Centennial 2021 Steering Committee. His latest book, Creating Sarasota County, was written to provide historical support for the Sarasota County Centennial 2021 celebration. So without further ado, here's Dr. Castle.
Well, Elena, thank you very much. Let me thank you, by the way. This is the first time we've looked at each other, but this did not all go smoothly for various reasons, and you did a great job of organizing this and putting all the pieces together that allowed tonight's event to take place. And I'd also like to make mention of the fact that your organization is part of the Centennial. You signed up to be a partner in the celebration of the Centennial year. And tonight's event is what you chose to do to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Sarasota County's establishment. And I thought you made a good choice, by the way. I mean, I'm certainly pleased to be here. What we're going to talk about tonight, for a while anyway, is Bertha Palmer of Chicago, and her background, and then her role in the development of Sarasota. And in doing that, I want to make mention of the fact that this is a very good topic for women for a whole variety of reasons. For women interested in the franchise and who has the franchise and how educated the public is and the rest of it. This is a good topic. This is a very good topic. And I say that in part because my mother was a member of the League of Women Voters on the North Shore of Chicago for decades. And she was born in 1918, 2 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified. And so she had a special feeling about voting, and she volunteered at the polls every year as long as she could to try to be sure that elections were held properly. And I think for her that the League of Women Voters was also a continuous learning process in which she was made knowledgeable about a great many issues affecting the nation, the state, and the community that we were living in. And so she treasured that. She was a farm girl, actually, came off a farm in central Indiana. And this was a real opportunity for her to learn about politics and democracy at all levels. She also came in contact with Bertha Palmer, not meeting her, although she was born in the year that Bertha Palmer died. But later in life, much later in life, she became acquainted with the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, which we'll talk about a little bit here, and Bertha Palmer's role in it. And she became so enamored of Bertha Palmer that she did a couple of things. One is that she studied everything she could find. She began lecturing throughout the Chicago area to women's groups, particularly about the fair and Bertha Palmer. She also started putting a lot of pressure on her older son, who was an historian at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And she kept suggesting to him that, he ought to, he'd really done quite enough work talking about American colonial and early national history. And he really ought to write about something far more interesting, like Bertha Palmer. And she got me. I mean, I ended up doing a great deal of research on the World's Fair, and she and I ended up leading tours of the fairgrounds at Jackson Park in Chicago. It was really quite a family affair. But the thing she really wanted me to do was write a biography of Bertha Palmer. And this book that I did write is not a complete biography of Bertha Palmer. It actually, its focus is a little bit different, but it nonetheless comes pretty close to being a biography. And she was delighted I was doing it. Unfortunately, she died before the book was published and complete. But I think she would have been pleased with what I did. Well, with that background, let me just start out, because I don't know you. I don't know you individually, and I don't know what you know about Bertha Palmer. You probably know about Spanish Point, which was the site of Bertha Palmer's estate, Winter Estate in Sarasota. You probably noticed some street signs that have Honore or Palmer on them. Yes, those all have to do with the Bertha Palmer and her family. Some of you may live in Palmer Ranch or on the area that we live in, which is Palmer Farms near Fruitville. So you may have some association, had some association with Bertha Palmer. But if you don't, I'm going to start out right at the beginning. She was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1849. Her father, who was a hardware man in Louisville, moved the entire family about the time of the Civil War to Chicago and went into real estate and was developing real estate in several different areas of the city. He did well. There were two daughters and three sons, and they all had excellent educations. Bertha particularly was promising academically and was sent to a private school in Georgetown, just outside of Washington, for her advanced education. In the course of things in Chicago, her father became a friend and not a business partner, but certainly somebody that traded business information with a fellow named Potter Palmer. And if there are any Chicagoans among you, Potter Palmer was the founder of of a lot of things. But the first thing he did was to develop a truly modern department store, one which influenced department stores all over the country and for that matter, over the Western world. He later sold out to Marshall Field. So if you're from Chicago, the Field family and Marshall Field and Company are very well known. And indeed, here in Sarasota, there is the Field Club, which was built by one of the members of the Field family, who was a very close friend of Bertha Palmer's older son. So there's a lot of connections on it. In any case, Potter Palmer saw her first when Bertha was about 13 years old. He swore that was the woman he was going to marry as soon as she was a real woman. And he did. Finally, when she was 22, they got married. He was 23 years older than she was. He had no other family. He was extraordinarily rich. He had, after his work in building the department store, he went in seriously into real estate and developed the State Street in Chicago as the main business area. And his friend Marshall Field went along with that and built a new store on State Street, which I guess now is a Macy's, isn't it? I mean, everything's a Macy's. But he also developed real estate on the north end of the loop at the end of Michigan Avenue, where he built a magnificent house, which was known by everybody in Chicago as the Castle, which you see a picture of right now, along with the mature Mrs. Potter Palmer. And it's from here that Bertha Palmer really had her first career, if we can call it that, and that was as the head of Chicago society. She became the Mrs. Astor of Chicago. She is the one who decided who was part of the elite and who was not. And it was done simply enough by the invitations that she issued or didn't issue, and the fact that the Chicago newspapers printed those lists. And if you weren't on them, it was a pretty clear sign that you had a long way to go in society before you were considered part of the elite. But interestingly, even in these early days, Mrs. Palmer was somebody that had multiple interests in life. She had interests in art. She had interests in flowers. She added an addition to her house for her growing art collection, and she added an addition to the house where she grew flowers, even creating a rose which bears her name. But more importantly, I think more importantly, She took a real interest in social concerns of the age, a very rambunctious and tumultuous period of time, urbanization and the Industrial Revolution, the sudden development of an American empire abroad. All sorts of things were happening in this period, and people were relocating. It was a huge time of movement from farm to city and from east to west. A lot of immigration was coming in. Every city had large immigrant populations, and they had special needs. In Chicago, of course, the person most associated with that was Jane Addams and the development of Hull House on the west side of the Loop in Chicago, which tended to the needs of thousands of Italian and East European immigrants that had moved into the area to work in the growing mills in Chicago. She became very concerned about what she saw there, and she actually she had joined the women's club in Chicago by that time, and she was writing papers even about how she was worried about the social conditions that were developing and the impact on families and women of what was happening and how something really needed to be done. She took a real interest in the economic conditions of women. For example, between her spectacular dinners and tea parties at the castle, she also invited the women of Chicago who made hats, the milliners. And they came to this fancy house. She fed them tea, they sat around, and she helped them form a union. That's an amazing thing for a woman of that class and stature and that age to have done. And so she was very well established in Chicago. But where things really change for her is when she becomes the head of the women's division of the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Clearly the greatest World's Fair of the 19th century. It may well have been the greatest World's Fair in the United States, maybe the world. It was an incredible affair. You're seeing a picture here which shows the administration building on the right and the machinery building on the left. They were part of a grand central area of the fair, which included the world's biggest building, the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building, which was so big it was a mile around its exterior if you wanted to walk it for exercise. In the women's building, I think we have a picture of the women's building here. Yes, we do. Well, we don't have that's the women's building in the background that you're seeing there. And there's Mrs. Palmer looking a little bit ethereal. That's her official World's Fair photo. What she's holding is not some sort of wand, it's actually a gavel, because she was the head of the women's division and convened the meetings. And that's the gavel that she used. You can also see that she was really quite a beautiful woman. I mean, she was often described as the epitome of American womanhood. That this is every American woman should aspire to look like this, and her friends and supporters always made a great deal out of that. Everything about the women's building and the women's division was driven by Mrs. Palmer's vision that this was to be a place where all of the achievements of women, not just in the United States, but around the world, were to be featured. And indeed, every book written by a woman, every women's club in America sent stuff for display at the building. They had lists of the memberships of all the women's clubs in America in there. Every painting they get their hands on. She actually commissioned top French and American artists to do the interior murals in this building. And then almost every day, there would be some sort of intellectual congress that would be held at the Women's Building, which dealt with all of the issues that affected women in that period of time. And all of the great heroines of social reform and political reform in the women's movement showed up to be part of those activities. She traveled to Europe. She met with kings and queens, the nobility. Actually, she already knew quite a few of them because she and her husband had traveled widely over the years since they both wanted to buy art. Their knowledge of the art world, particularly of the Impressionists, was incredible. They literally dined with Monet at his home in Giverny. I don't know if any of you have been there to see it. We walked through there in the garden, which he used as a background or as the subject of his paintings. Well, they were there and had dinner. And so she not only had these great Impressionist art pieces, but she knew personally the artists who had done them. In any case, it was a great success for women. Many groups tried to use the World's Fair to advance their goals. Some did well, others did not. African Americans did not. It was just the dawning age of segregation and of Jim Crow, and it was just not a good time. Labor did reasonably well at campaigning for the 8-hour day, but it was really women led by Bertha Palmer that used the fair most effectively to promote their goals. But then the question became, after the fair was over, it was only a 6-month fair, and here was this woman who had had been the welcomer to the world. I mean, the castle had been the site of many dinners with everything from the President of the United States to the ambassadors of the nations that were participating in the fair. And she was the one that was greeting them all. And so she was extraordinarily well known on the international stage. There was probably few, if any, American women that were better known in the world at the time than Bertha Honoré Palmer. But then the question was, what do you do after a triumph like that? What do you do with your life? Well, in part, she went back to running Chicago society, but she also did some other things, and she began to spend more time in Europe. And she latches on to King Edward VII, who you're seeing a picture of now. If you're not familiar with Edward VII, the Playboy King, he was the son of Queen Victoria, and took over ruling the British Empire when she died. He liked women, and he particularly liked rich American women, and there were several that he kept in his inner social circle. One of them was Bertha Palmer. This was an age, by the way, where rich American women were considered extraordinarily desirable in England by penurious English lords who had lots of property and a title and no money, and saw an opportunity to improve their situation, and the women were somewhat interested in the title and the land and being part of the whole royal court scene. So, but Bertha, although she was, a couple of guys went after her, was clearly not interested. And indeed, she never did remarry. Her husband had died, by the way, in 1902. And so she goes back by January, the beginning of 1910. She's back in Chicago. She's back in the castle, and it's and if any of you are from Chicago, you know that January and February are not good months in Chicago, particularly if you're living in a big drafty mansion. And so she's reading the Chicago Tribune and sees an ad for land in a place called Sarasota. And the ad is placed in the Chicago Tribune by Joseph H. Lord, who is a guy from Maine, who is 6'5", an ex-football player, and a lawyer who had migrated at one point to Sarasota, had bought up an enormous amount of land, and he was in Chicago, and he set up an office in Chicago to try to sell that land to rich Chicagoans and entice them to come down. And Bertha, after meeting him, decides that that's good. Actually, that's worth it. And so within 2 weeks, she's on her private Pullman car with members of her family, traveling down to Sarasota. That's how she gets here. And she meets, when she gets off the train, she's greeted by Arthur Britton Edwards, who was born in 1874. He is probably the only major figure in this whole story that actually was born in this area. Everybody else is pretty much like most of us, we migrated down here at one time or another. The town of Sarasota and the area that would become Sarasota County, it was Manatee County, southern part of Manatee County in those days, was in very bad economic straits and had been for some years. There were probably only 900 people living in the town of Sarasota. There may have been 2,000 altogether living in what we now think of as Sarasota County. But all of that changed in a remarkably short period of time once Mrs. Palmer made a fundamental decision. And that decision was not only to build her winter home, which is the Oaks here, not only to build her winter home here, but to become an active entrepreneur in Sarasota. That she's decided at age 61, which is pretty old for that period, that she is going to make money. I mean, she inherited something like $6 million from her husband, who, you know, and she didn't need to do anything. She could easily have lived out the rest of her life in luxury and done anything she wanted. But she decides that she's not done yet. Here she is on the frontier, and that's what Sarasota was. And in essence, she does what a lot of Americans did in the West and in Florida. They reinvented themselves. They made something out of themselves they had not been. And so the society queen becomes a great entrepreneur in agriculture and property and all sorts of things. She has to learn, she has to re-educate herself entirely to be successful in what she sets out to do. Now, this picture you're seeing, the Oaks at Osprey, let me explain. That was her winter home. Osprey Point was the name of her estate, and the Oaks was the name of the house, the estate house on it. And if anybody wants to know more about that, we can talk about it. It was, in fact, she brought in a Chicago architect that worked with an existing structure and created one of the grandest houses in the southwest coast of Florida. A key to Osprey Point were the gardens. As part of Edward VII's social circle, she had traveled around England. She'd stayed in many mansions, rural mansions. She had seen the English gardening of the age up close, and that's kind of what she copies when she gets to Sarasota, although you can't plant the same things. Now, the next thing she did, though, was to develop meadowsweet pastures, which was her hog and cattle ranch, 15,000 acres out on the Myakka River, which today is the heart of the Myakka State Park. Now, what she did there is really interesting because she had to master, by using materials she got from the United States Department of Agriculture and from the Florida Extension Service. She had to master every aspect of hog breeding, cattle breeding, selling, buying. I mean, she had to learn it all from scratch. Her papers are here in Sarasota at Sarasota County Historical Resources. And having been through them, I can tell you they are loaded with all kinds of publications from these government agencies that she ordered in order to learn how to do these things. Now, Meadowsweet Pastures, by the way, was also a personal retreat for Bertha and her family. She had 2 sons. They produced grandchildren. Here we see Honoré Palmer, I think it is.
No, Dorset.
Dorsey. Oh, yes. This is the ne'er-do-well. If anybody wants to know about this character, you can ask me later. He dies in a bar brawl later in life. But here he is, a cute little kid. And there's the cowboy from Wyoming that Bertha hired to sort of teach all her kids outdoor life, how to, and of course, these family outings out at, and there still remains of all of this at Myakka State Park. I think if you're nice to the rangers, they'll show you where to go to see the remains of this. Well, final point on that, that she transforms her innovations in cattle and hog raising, transforms those industries in this part of Florida. And because she shows rather quickly that if you do it right, you can make money. And even these hardened characters that were already here raising hogs and cattle had to finally admit that the lady from Chicago really was pretty smart. I don't think they ever said it, but I think they had to admit it to themselves. Now, the most important work that she did, though, has to do with how she brought a population to Sarasota. The thing that was really missing to drive Sarasota's development were people. You needed to bring in people. And she bought 140,000 acres of land and made her the biggest landowner, biggest taxpayer in Manatee County. But the problem was that much of that land was underwater all or part of the year. I mean, this is South Florida, so, the southern part of Florida. So, it was very low country. This was a marshland for all practical purposes. What she does is come up with an idea for planned agricultural communities. And it's apparently, as far as I can tell, almost unique in the United States. And I really don't know where she got the idea, although it seems to be somewhat based on her work in developing urban plan developments. And she did one of those in Sarasota as well. But here, you're talking about, say, Bee Ridge Farms, which was the first one she did. It's a picture of a little white church she helped finance for the community of Bee Ridge which was actually a Palmer company town. What she did was to remake the land. I mean, to cut the jungle down, and she hired lots and lots of people to come in and to dig canals that drained the water off. And then other work gangs that dug wells. That seems strange. You're getting rid of the water and yet you're digging down to get more water. Well, the answer is, as we all know, we have a wet season and a dry season. And if you're going to grow all year round, which is the real attraction to farmers coming to Florida, then in the dry season, you got to be able to bring water to the surface. And in wet season, you got to get rid of that excess water. She did that. She put in a whole infrastructure of railroads and roads and towns and churches, you name it, she put them in. She even put in schools that would teach Northerners coming from cities that wanted to kind of get away from cities and to live a better life. And she would sell them 10, 20 acre farms. They could grow vegetables and they could grow citrus, and they didn't know anything about it. So she set up a school. She also set up a test farm where they could, be trained and also see what was possible, what could be grown in Sarasota. Well, she sold that out, 8,000 acres. She sold it out to people all over the world. Came to Sarasota. It wasn't just locals, and it wasn't just Americans. Other people came to Sarasota, often buying the land sight unseen from the Palmer Company. And after that sold out, then she opened up another 5,000 acres, not too far away, and fill that up as well. And by the time she dies, the population has escalated in Sarasota. And it's no longer in the economic doldrums because the population drives everything. It drives the fact that you got to have lawyers and doctors and all kinds of professional people and Ford Motor Company salesmen and whatever to sell the Model Ts. You got to have them. And the result was that the growing rural population drove the development of the city of Sarasota and other communities in the district. I mean, it's hard to say what would have happened if she hadn't done that sort of thing. She also, of course, in the process, convinces a bunch of her rich friends from Chicago and New York and elsewhere to buy property from her and come down and build fancy houses down here. And those people, of course, are the ones that have the money to drive the cultural development of Sarasota, which is so attractive to so many of us. She died in 1918 of breast cancer. She died down here. She was put back on the Pullman car, taken back to Chicago, very dramatic, large wedding with masses of people around the castle. And then the body was escorted by masses of people through the streets of Chicago to Graceland Cemetery on the north side. Here you see this Ionic temple that Mrs. Palmer had designed before she died. There's two big sarcophagi there. One for Potter Palmer, who had preceded her, and one for her. The rest of the family, for the most part, are buried underneath the stones there. And I'll make my usual crack that you can't take it with you when you die, but these rich people in Chicago took it absolutely as far as they could. I mean, the whole cemetery looks like this. It is, huge, fancy places to house these corpses. She left her, how much time we got left her?
You've gone 35 minutes.
Hmm?
You've gone 35.
I've gone 35 minutes. All right. I think I will probably stop there. I was intending to tell you something about what happened after she died. And we're showing the Art Institute here because much of her Impressionist art, well, today, all of her Impressionist art is located in the Chicago Art Institute. But she left for up until the 1950s, a large number of her Impressionist paintings actually still hung at the Oaks, which was open on weekends for 50 cents. You could go in and take a look at Mrs. Potter Palmer's house. Now, if anybody wants to ask about it, I would have talked about Honoré and Potter Palmer, their two sons, and a fascinating episode of Prince and Princess Michael Katatkuzin, a Russian prince who married to Bertha's niece. But I think I will not do that because I promised that I would try to hold this to a certain amount of time. I just say briefly in conclusion, if you're trying to add up what the Palmers did, it's first of all population, driving the population, the creation of a solid agricultural base for the community. That was key. But at the same time, they were bringing in the rich, and that had a lot to do with the perceptions nationally and internationally of Sarasota. It meant a lot in those days that you could live in a community that had been the winter home of Mrs. Potter Palmer. So they were the prime, and I would have talked also, and you may want to ask about it, because the women play a key role in the fight to create Sarasota County. They get the vote in 1920, but the vote to create Sarasota County is the first significant local vote. And women are mobilized for that. And it's in and of itself an interesting story of how that was done. But I think, Elena, in deference to our agreement, I will stop here.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Castle. That's, just my head is like, oh my gosh, there's so much that you have researched, and there are bits and pieces of Sarasota County that we owe to Bertha Palmer. Really, there's a lot more than I think most people realize. We do have a question from Donna, who said, who asked, was she self-taught and intuitive, or how was she educated? Sounds like she had a lot of resources and was highly intellectual. Did you understand that?
Well, in general, I mean, there's several kinds of education that are involved here. One is that she is groomed for high society. So, her mother and others are teaching her all that she needs to know about social life. I mean, she's a debutante. She's introduced into society along with the other Debs at some point. But she had all of the skills needed to be a success in high society. Her academic training, she began with a private school in Chicago, and then, and this is not an age where a lot of women get much education. There's some, but it's not a general thing. In her case, she was sent to this essentially girls' school in Georgetown, and her school, I've seen her school records, and she aced everything. And it was everything from piano playing through to literature. I mean, everything that she, and the language, of course, she spoke French. It's not surprising her family had French origins, but she spoke French flawlessly. And her manners were impeccable. I mean, it's kind of a combination. I mean, she goes into the world well equipped for this. What she wasn't well equipped to do was to raise hogs. And the challenge is that she has to remake herself in not just into a business person, but into somebody that is technically knowledgeable about a whole bunch of stuff. And she attacks it like she did everything else in life. She attacks it and she learns it. She's tough as nails. I mean, we haven't gotten into that, but beneath that exterior, when pressed, she was as tough as they came, and people did not mess with her. And some people in Sarasota learned not to mess with her. And nonetheless, she never said a nasty word to anybody. I mean, it was, I mean, she always was polite. She spoke with a soft Southern accent, and charming to everybody, but don't cross her. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Another interested viewer is Meredith, who said, please say more about her enlightened labor policies and her training of workers to organize.
Well, I don't think she trained them to organize, as far as I know. I mean, the Milliners Union is the chief example of her hands-on, being hands-on involved in a labor situation in which she was trying to help these women have a better economic situation. I should say that Mrs. Palmer, when she looked at women and families, was primarily concerned about the economic aspects of it, not the political, but the economic. For her, the preeminent issue for women in that age was equal pay for equal work. And she arrived at that. What she was seeing was that she was not disputing, she wasn't going to get in a fight with men over that women belong in the home and not in the workplace. Rather, what she was saying was, whatever you guys think ought to be happening, the reality is that women are driven into the workforce by men who are incompetent husbands, men who get drunk, men who drink up their wages, men who don't take their parental duties seriously. And women have to go out and work to keep the family together, to put food in the mouths of the children. And yet when they do that, when they go into the workplace, they are discriminated against by employers who realize that these women are doing something that is socially frowned on by society generally. And so they justify paying them lesser wages than they pay men for doing the same work. And she sees that as kind of the major problem. But interestingly, in a couple of speeches, she lets slip another thought, which is occasionally she'll speculate on the fact, well, you know, once women get into the workplace, they kind of like it. I mean, they're making something of themselves. They're facing challenges. They're not just doing the housework. They're doing something. They're doing something else, and that they become, in her mind, better women and more independent women because of that work experience. Now she doesn't make that all the time, but the equal pay for equal work particularly at the World's Fair. She spoke a number of times when the President of the United States was present, and she really went at it on those occasions.
Mhm.
And I find that very interesting in her. You know, I mean, this is not a woman that needed to be involved in that sort of thing, and women of her class were not normally involved in that. She even took an interest in English socialism. She had a couple of dinners in Chicago where she hosted English socialists that were touring the United States.
Mhm.
So Mrs. Palmer is not easy to come to grips with. I mean, her education, her natural intelligence, they make her interesting. That's why she's so much fun to write about. But she can't be categorized easily.
Yeah, that's what it seems like for sure. Thank you for that. We have another question, a little more directed towards the history. And the question is, will you please tell us more about Bee Ridge becoming a Palmer company town?
Well, the whole Bee Ridge area was part of Mrs. Palmer's original purchases from Joseph H. Lord and others. She bought the whole Venice area, much of the Bay Shore up to Sarasota, and big blocks of land that were to the south and to the east of Sarasota. And Bee Ridge was a ridge. I mean, it's important that it had the word ridge in it because ridges were ancient seashores where the sea flooded Florida for some eons and piled up stuff. And that's what a ridge is. Well, ridges were higher, not much higher, but high enough that people could build houses and grow crops on them. So people have been living in the Bee Ridge area for some time. But when Mrs. Palmer took over, she decided to make that the centerpiece of her planned agricultural settlement idea. And so she began by platting. I mean, I'm not sure people know enough about the history here. The town of Bee Ridge is not on Bee Ridge Road. I don't know if everybody understands that. It's at the corner of Proctor and McIntosh. And our historical commission put up there are several historical markers on that corner, but there's nothing really left. I mean, even the railroad tracks, I notice, have now been taken up. One of the things Mrs. Palmer did, by the way, was insist that a railroad track be laid from Sarasota through all her lands all the way to Venice. That's called the Venice Extension. And today we've just turned it into a bike path, but it's still there, which is interesting. But there's really not much there, but it was the second biggest community in Sarasota in what would become Sarasota County, by what, 1916, 17, 18, somewhere in there. I mean, people flooded in. What was happening is that she was using the town as the center for this 8,000 acre operation. So you had 10 and 20, this whole 8,000 acres was cut up into 10 and 20 acre farms. The farms, as I mentioned, had already been set up. The forest, the woods had all been cut. You had canals dug. Everything was in place. Roads ran past every single plot of land. And then you had the central company town of Bee Ridge. which had a railroad station. And interestingly, the railroad company was so confident in the future of Bee Ridge that it built a station capable of dealing with 5,000 people. Now, it never happened. It never got to that size. If you look at the plat, it looks like the streets of downtown Chicago. She kind of used the loop streets for the names of streets in this company town. She built a wood working operation. She built or helped to build a tomato canning operation, because tomatoes actually were a very good crop, except for the fact that they spoiled rapidly. And even though you had cooled rail cars, still the amount of time that it usually took to get stuff to the railroad station, let alone onto the cars and then hooked up to trains and taken to New York or Montreal or wherever they were going, meant that you had a high spoilage rate. Well, one way to deal with that was tomato canning. And so Bee Ridge had a very, very big tomato canning operation, which provided income to the people there. There's a whole history to Bee Ridge. It's interesting. It's really forgotten history. It's amazing that this area, which was so pivotal in the history of Sarasota County, has by and large just fallen off the radar. But as I say, it was once the second biggest, as far as I can tell, the second biggest community that existed there in the county.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's really a lot of stuff we don't normally hear about. So thank you for that. There was a question about the pronunciation of the honoré, and some people say it a little differently. So which one is correct? What's the correct pronunciation?
It's French. It has its emphasis is on the last E, honoré.
Okay.
That's why it's got that little thing over the E.
Yeah, I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah. So everybody that came tonight now knows to call it honoré.
Honoré, yeah. It's like 1 minute before 8, but there was one last question about if you could say more about how women were essential to Sarasota becoming a county.
Okay, and I'm not sure I can do it in a minute. There was a huge, you have to read my other book in essence to get the full story here, reading Sarasota County. But in May of 1921, there was a big brawl that went on between Bradenton and Sarasota, Bradentown and Sarasota, and over the whole question of whether Sarasota would be an independent county. And there was a negotiation in Bradentown, and the result was that the guys creating Sarasota County had to give up 4 townships in the northeast corner of the county. So if you look at a map of the county of Sarasota, you're going to see the corners missing. And is part of Manatee County. And I won't go into why that was done, but that's what the deal was. But when the governor signed the legislation, it included a provision that the people of Sarasota County had to, or the future Sarasota County, or the possible future Sarasota County, had to vote on whether they agreed and approved what the legislature or the governor had done. And that meant there had to be a vote a month later. And that's where the women became very important, because they were now eligible to vote, but largely uneducated as to how to vote. I mean, you got poll taxes, for example. How do you deal with poll taxes? and where do you vote, and about registration. And there's a number of technical issues that are not in and of themselves difficult, but if you're a woman that has never done anything like that. I mean, one of the tough things was when you went to register, you had to give your full name. Now, most women never used their first names publicly. They were Mrs. Potter Palmer, not Bertha Palmer, but Mrs. Potter Palmer. So to go into a public situation and just say your name was, for some of them, a challenge, difficult. Now, who stepped in? Well, the Chamber of Commerce in Sarasota really played a very active role, but the key to it was really the Women's Club of Sarasota and the Sarasota Times. The Sarasota Times was the only newspaper in what was Sarasota County, or would become Sarasota County. And the Rose Wilson was the owner, publisher, reporter, editor, distributor of the Sarasota Times. Now, Rose Wilson is the real is a heroine in this story of how we became a county. And the way she used her newspaper to promote the idea of countyhood was essential. She worked hand in glove with the Chamber of Commerce and with the special committees that were working to make this thing happen. But she took a particular interest in the women. She had been one of the, excuse me, one of the founders of the Women's Club, along with Bertha Palmer and others. And she worked with the Women's Club to set up a meeting for all the women of Sarasota. Anybody that wanted to come, any woman that wanted to come would come, and they could get the facts. This is a real League of Women Voter-esque activity. That the women had a special committee of the Women's Club that arranged this. They brought in the leaders of the county movement who addressed the women and told them what the issues were, and there were explanations on voting and all sorts of things. And at the end, an issue arose about women and money and paying the poll tax. And the poll tax had some arcane aspects to it, but you did have to pay taxes on it. In fact, you technically were supposed to pay for 2 years. Now, a lot of these women, were, that didn't come as a given that they would be able to lay their hands on it. Now, I don't know how to present this to you in a good way, but the answer that the Chamber of Commerce came up with was very simple. The guy that was the executive director stood up and said, "Ladies, don't worry about it. We'll pay the poll tax for you." Now, if that's buying votes, I don't know, but anyway, they had no way of really discriminating between male and female votes. But the stories that we pick up on that are that there were a lot of the women that went to the polls, particularly in the city of Sarasota, to vote. And the vote eventually was about 80% for and 20% against. So,
Wow.
but the women were very, very important. And if they hadn't been paid attention to, who knows what would have happened.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's
So,
a great story. Great story.
The League of Women Voters can see their roots right there.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for this entire presentation. I think all of us that have been on here learned a great deal about the beginnings of Sarasota and how much really we owe to Bertha Palmer and what she did for us and our community. So thank you so much. We appreciate your time and all of the research that you did to make, all this whole presentation and for us aware of it. And congratulations on your book being chosen. I know it's towards the end of the year now, but it still is a centennial year. So thank you once again. We
Well, thank
appreciate
you.
all
You've
your
been a
time.
great audience, good questions. Been a
Yeah.
fun evening. Thank
Okay,
you for
well,
asking.
yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much. Yeah.
Thank
Very
you.
informative.
All right.
Very
Yes, thank you.
Glad you enjoyed it.